Welcome to Workforces. I'm Julian Alssid.
And I'm Caitlin Lemoyne, and we speak with the innovators who shape the future of work and learning.
Together, we unpack the complex elements of workforce and career preparation and offer practical solutions that can be scaled and sustained.
Workforces is supported by Lumina Foundation. Lumina is an independent private foundation in Indianapolis that is committed to making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to all. Let's dive in.
You know, Julian, when we talk about and use the term workforce development, it can sound like we're talking about one system, but really it's an interconnected web-like set of systems. It's not just one thing.
A web is a good way to put it. You've got education and training programs, employer needs, government policies, economic data, new technologies, and people seeking to advance their careers. So all these different pieces, and they're all influencing each other. You can't really address one without thinking about the others.
Yeah, exactly. It requires so much collaboration. Educators need to talk to employers, policymakers need to listen to communities, and it's not just a top-down function either. You need input from the people going through the trainings and the workers trying to navigate their careers as well.
Which is why I'm excited that we're talking with Kerry McKittrick today from the Harvard Project on Workforce. Kerry's helping to make sense of the work happening across these interconnected systems.
The Harvard Project on Workforce is an interdisciplinary applied research project between the Harvard Kennedy School, the Harvard Business School, and the Harvard Graduate School of Education that examines workforce development and the future of work from these various vantage points. In Kerry's role as co-director, she leads the project's policy, research, and partnership strategy and spearheads initiatives focused on building better pathways to economic mobility. She's co-authored multiple papers focused on education, training, and career navigation, and she speaks regularly about issues at the intersection of education and work.
And prior to joining the Project on Workforce, Kerry was a senior manager at Jobs for the Future and served as a senior policy advisor on education, workforce, civil rights, and child welfare policy for Congressman Jim Langevin. She started her career in politics, serving as a campaign manager for Massachusetts State Rep Ken Gordon. Thanks so much for joining us today, Kerry.
Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of the podcast and excited to chat.
We're excited to connect and chat with you today as well, Kerry. Thanks so much for joining us here. So as we jump in today, can you please tell us a bit more about your background and your role at the Project on Workforce?
Absolutely. So I come from a political policy background, and it was actually through that work, through working with a congressman from Rhode Island, Jim Langevin, who really was interested in career and technical education, that my eyes were kind of opened to the workforce development and career and technical education world. And, you know, I found it really interesting because unlike many policy areas, it's pretty bipartisan. We were able to find some great agreements across Democratic sides and Republican sides, and between employers and educators. Everyone sort of agreed that this type of approach was extremely necessary to both fill what was called at the time, the skills gap, but also expand equity. And so, I did that work in Washington, got a little bit tired. As you may imagine, my heart goes out to all the folks still doing this work. It's really amazing in Washington. But wanted to kind of dig deeper into the broader ecosystem. And as you were saying, really understand all of the different players and their roles and their unique levers for driving economic mobility. So I was fortunate to work at Jobs for the Future, and now at the Project on Workforce, I'm thrilled to sit at the intersection of all of these players and try to make research accessible. So often I feel like research is on one side and practitioners are kind of on the other. And so it's important to ground the practice conversation in the evidence. And really, our mission is to build better pathways to economic mobility for workers and learners who haven't been served well by our systems in the past. And so we advance research on, education and workforce transitions. We focus on the role of community colleges and regional economic development, the I would say role of career navigation supports in economic advancement, and workforce policy and education policy at both the state and federal levels.
So Kerry, yeah, so you do indeed sit in the middle of it all, and which is great. And your research coming out of the center out of the project has been quite amazing. As we seek to remain kind of current on the on the future of work and learning, what are some of the trends you're seeing? And tell us about some of your most research and related findings.
I think that's a great question because things are shifting pretty rapidly beneath our feet, and it's a complex, complicated time to be doing this work. I think one of the things we're focused on at the project is really shifting workforce policy at the state level. And we recently released a report focused on the role of governors in shaping workforce development systems. And we focused on governors because they have a unique position both under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act from the federal level, as well as over the state's agencies, which, because we know workforce touches everything from education systems to economic development systems to childcare and transportation. All of these issues are really interconnected, and governors have a unique ability to bridge those gaps. And so we wanted to understand, because there is a lack of research on this topic and on what states are doing at the workforce level, we wanted to understand what governors were focused on. What were their priorities? What are some of their strategies and processes that they're deploying as they try to address low labor force participation? And I call that out because when we were interviewing governors' workforce advisors to do this research, 60% discussed low labor force participation as a key driving factor that was contributing to their workforce development strategy. And so I can go a little bit deeper, but I'll highlight 5 trends that we saw at the state level. The first is that organizational structures are shifting across states. So we're seeing, in a lot of cases, agencies being merged, whether that's education and workforce agencies or workforce and economic development. We're seeing new stakeholder-driven approaches to WIOA planning. So we asked about, some of the Workforce Opportunity Act. I think the listeners know WIOA is the acronym for that. But in many cases, these are resource-intensive processes, but states are really engaging with stakeholders and understanding both with employers, with industry associations, to really understand the challenges that they're facing. And then the third piece was this dual customer approach to workforce development. So serving both employers and individuals, both job seekers and job holders. And so I think, balancing that support between quality jobs and job demand is something that came up in our interviews. 75% of folks mentioned this as a tension they were addressing. And then the last 2 trends are really trying to address some of the challenges with WIOA funding, federal funding in general, coming up with creative approaches using governor's reserve funds in innovative ways. And then the last is, really investing in targeted training towards youth, towards underrepresented populations like justice-involved folks, and investing in wraparound supports. So 60% of the folks we talked to mentioned childcare as a really important component of a workforce development strategy. Particularly in the wake of COVID, folks were seeing, so many caregivers leaving the workforce. And right now, the challenge in many states is how to bring people back and how to adopt this sort of whole of life, whole of government perspective to workforce development.
So that's a lot. It's a very, very, what you're seeing. So it's very comprehensive, very systemic. It's great to know that states are moving in these directions. Are there priorities that are standing out among the kind of array of shifts you're seeing that cut across states? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say the industry partnerships, really focusing on key sectors. At the time that we were doing these interviews, which was during 2024 from April through December, folks were really focused on clean energy. They were focused on semiconductor manufacturing. A lot of these industries that actually were being targeted by the Biden administration for industrial policy. So we were seeing that states are really investing in industry as partners. In some cases, providing incentives for folks to hire underserved populations. In other cases, building kind of customized training programs. In other cases, this is a extremely, I think, promising practice, providing business navigators. So a point of contact for a business to help navigate the workforce system, which is not easy to do. So I think there are a lot of exciting, promising practices out there, and focusing on this dual customer approach is certainly something we're seeing become more of a trend.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I'm wondering, Kerry, going back to one of the first things you said around the priorities, you had mentioned, or the 5 trends rather, you had mentioned agencies that are merging. And I was just curious to hear a little bit more about that. What are some of, kind of what are you seeing merge and what are the reasons for it, for those mergers to be occurring?
So in some states, there's been efforts to merge education departments and workforce development departments. And in part, this makes it slightly easier to braid funding. So there are a lot of, obstacles to braiding Perkins or education funding and workforce funding. But because workforce funds are so low, and we could have an hour-long conversation about that, there's, really a need to kind of be creative in braiding funds. So that's kind of one piece. The other reason we saw was trying to build workforce pipelines that start at the youth level. So starting in K-12 with career and technical education, moving through community colleges up to workforce, and community colleges starting to serve a real kind of integral role as upskilling institutions for their communities. So an effort to build these pipelines, 1 in 4 of the states we talked to mention youth apprenticeships as a priority. So merging these agencies helps folks to really improve the coordination across the board. And then I would say the other piece, the other merging that we were seeing was, and this wasn't across the board, right? This was just, several states, was economic development or commerce with workforce. And this allowed for more business services to be integrated with workforce services. And a few of those that I just mentioned, but we're seeing, one of the trends that I've observed is really the use of workforce policy as business engagement policy, because businesses, it's far more than just perhaps a tax incentive for moving to a specific area. It's really incentivizing workforce support and workforce investment, because this is what businesses need too, and it's also helping states grow.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting to think, to kind of hear these are the different ways that really these different players are almost de-siloing their efforts, right? Like you're saying about building that pipeline. What does it look like to build an education and economic development pipeline, kind of like K on up, right? Like let's start at the very beginning and all work together kind of throughout and across these systems. So that's exciting to hear. You're seeing as like kind of an emerging trend in this space.
Exactly. And I think another thing I'd add to that is career exploration becoming a bigger trend, especially at the youth level, and understanding that, many people might not know what a career in semiconductor manufacturing is. I think I still don't. So for young people, to really have the opportunity to explore, to figure out, this is something that could leverage my talents. This could be something I want to do, is an effective and kind of exciting way to go. I would say, one of the other things I would add around this career navigation and career support piece is the need for more career coaches. So in addition to the childcare trend, a half of states mention career navigation or career coaching as a priority, both at the youth level, but also at the adult level. But there's an acknowledgement that there's a massive shortage of coaches. And then the funding for these support services is also pretty low.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've seen in our work, like, it's almost like there are all these there's new sub-industries within industries. There are new jobs that it's like, what are these jobs, right? Like, you hear it, but then it's actually like, well, what do you do day to day? It seems, as you're saying, it just feels like there's so much work to be done around like further defining these new and emerging roles that, maybe haven't been around that long or have experienced really significant shifts in recent years.
Mhm.
So it sounds like it's kind of, you're seeing different flavors or different accommodations around the country in the way governors are tackling this. And I'm interested, one of the things we've seen in the past with some of the reforms, that involve collaboration among the education, workforce, and economic development actors is that they kind of come and go with leaders and administrations and that. So what do you see states doing to kind of bake this work? You talked about some, merging of agencies and that sort of thing, but even on like the highest sort of coordination level, like who's leading this work for states?
In part because, we did see some of the merging of agencies as a key lever that was implemented with new administrations. So it was something that governors could do right away. I think, we did hear in our interviews that different transitions across administrations was difficult, particularly given, usual funding silos. But, one thing that I think is interesting, one of the things we drilled down on was the use of governor's reserve funds. So these are the governor's set-aside funds under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And in some cases, so this, is something from year to year that could change. States have their plans, but governors ideally have some flexibility and some discretion over where these funds go. In some cases, folks actually said, oh, well, it's been decided by the administration before us. It's hard for us to use this as a priority. In other cases, it was used to backfill administration costs. But what I want to highlight here, which I think is interesting, is that there are certain cases in which people are using these funds to test ideas that are then that once they prove the efficacy can then be signed into law and funded at the state level. So I want to, and I think that's a really interesting way of continuing it post a certain administration. So an example of this is Washington State. So the governor launched an initiative called Economic Security for All, which provided, using the governor's reserve funds, which provided wraparound supports and financial assistance for folks just above the WIOA income threshold. It did that for 4 years, studied it, found massive wage gains, and had huge success. And because of that, the state signed it into law and added state appropriations to fund it. So this was able to kind of continue past the administration, which I think is a really promising use for those funds when they're available. I mean, again, the small funding levels continue to be a challenge, especially for small states. Who still have to maintain the data systems, right? Who still have to administer a lot of these practices, but don't have as much funding as a larger state does, just based on the formula.
So building on that last comment, certainly, the small dollars, I guess we would say, is maybe one of the challenges here. But based on your research and findings, what do you see as some of the other challenges to address that states are addressing or working to address around the effective use of WIOA dollars and other workforce funding dollars as well?
Yeah, I think, lack of good data and information is a real challenge. Folks are, investing in data systems. There's a great, data quality, data workforce quality fund through workforce innovation, and many states are investing in state longitudinal data systems. So there's progress there. But this is still a place where we could use a lot of investment and a lot of improvement. We've done some analysis of state WIOA websites. This was a few years ago, and found that many of them, the most of them, didn't have clear outcomes data on earnings or completion rate or employment after a training program. So not only does this, harm an individual who's trying to use WEOS services to upskill, but it also makes it difficult for states that are trying to direct resources or allocate resources strategically. So I think we need a lot more investment in data systems so we can understand what works and provide information for, job seekers so they can make the decisions that are right for them.
So, Kerry, I know you say you're a regular listener, and we do appreciate that. And as you know, one of the questions we like to ask all of our guests is, what are your recommendations for how our audience can become forces in applying, in your case, your research findings to policy and program designs?
I often say that my worst nightmare is our research sits on a shelf and no one uses it or looks at it. So I appreciate any opportunity to tell people to go to our website and look at our research. But in all seriousness, I think that grounding conversations at the regional level in data and evidence is crucial. I think a lot of conversations that are happening are more anecdotal, like, oh, we know this employer has a shortage, or we're hearing that people maybe like this program, or these jobs may be in demand. I would encourage folks to use our research, use some of our data tools like the Workforce Almanac, which maps out the workforce sector, different providers across the country, to actually start these conversations between employers, policymakers, and educators at a common place. Say, okay, this is not the end of the discussion. The data isn't the end of the discussion, but it's the start, and it allows us to, kind of not base our strategies and our practices on assumptions, what we might think is happening, but really to look at a common ground of this is what we're actually seeing. So using real-time labor market information, these are the job postings that are in demand, or using our research on some of the best practices around college to job pipeline to say workforce or work-based learning programs have the strongest evidence behind them. Let's use that as a starting point to bridge our partnerships, to realize and to integrate some of the best practices. But again, these are regional conversations. This is very place-based work, right? And so, hopefully these are tools, but we don't think these are, necessarily the answers. There's a lot more work to do. A lot more research questions out there that we need to answer, but hopefully it's a good start in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is such a key piece of this work, right? It's like, how can we draw from best practices and like common processes that seem to work really well? And then at what point do you say, okay, but what's happening locally, regionally, and what does that mean for like what we actually do on the ground, right? And I feel like it's a complicated balancing act of trying to learn from what's working well in different areas, but then also saying, well, what's unique to this region, and where are what strengths should we leverage, right, or build upon? It feels like I don't know if you were finding that in your research at all, but I feel like that's just living in this work. I feel like that's one thing that's always like top of mind for us. It's like, how can you take what's a best practice, but also really apply it in a localized way that makes sense for wherever you're working.
Absolutely. We've done some research on community colleges, as I mentioned at the beginning, and their role in their ecosystems. And we specifically looked in one project on how they were using data, real-time labor market data, to drive some of their programs. And we found that while that was a great tool and it was a great starting point, it actually didn't provide all the answers. And so having conversations, validating and supplementing that data with conversations with employers was just as crucial. And so I absolutely think you're right. There are, differences. A job that may be in demand in one area is not in another area, right? It's so regionally specific. A challenge of out migration in one area may not be the same in another, right? Different industries require different types of services. So that's why we've tried to kind of pull out some of these shining examples and some of the best practices. Hopefully in our research, we hope institutions or states can look at it and say, oh, there's an example that maybe applies to my situation or my context. And that I can use. I can see a small state, a state like Wyoming is not going to have the same sort of workforce context as California or New York, but perhaps they can look to another state and say, I can learn from that one. And so there's a lot of that we try to do too. I think the quantitative data is great, but the qualitative data is equally important. And looking at the case studies and really what works for different contexts is crucial.
Well, and Kerry, you said it a couple of times. I think the notion of the data as a starting point for discussion is so key. And even then, looking at other examples around the country, and it's all kind of this iterative process that goes straight back to the dual customer approach. And you just kind of have to keep, testing and test the numbers, test the hypotheses, iterate, et cetera. And then the economies keep changing and demographics keep shifting. So it really is this kind of ongoing, living, breathing kind of organism, this workforce system.
Absolutely. I think, and the labor market changes faster often than the system does, which is certainly a challenge, particularly, I think, for education systems, for trainers. Keeping up with the labor market is a challenge, particularly today with all of these kind of technological advancements. And generative AI is changing things faster than, I think we would expect. And there's just a lot of unknowns out there. And so being responsive, continuing those relationships in a meaningful way, I think is crucial. Sometimes it's easy to say, oh, develop a partnership. Well, what does that look like? What does that mean, right? Like what is a good kind of communication cadence? So I think that's where learning from other examples is especially crucial.
Absolutely. So Kerry, as we wind down our discussion, how can learners learn more and to continue to follow your work?
We have a newsletter. Please sign up for a newsletter on our website. I promise we won't inundate you every week. We send it out when we have new releases. And follow us on LinkedIn. We try to, blast out a lot of our research and other research that we may not be doing, but that we may see folks from other centers, finding the latest data on generative AI. The other day, we posted research from several researchers, but including one of our faculty directors, actually Alssid, on the use of generative AI as a team member. So in addition to our own reports, we have all sorts of, in our own ecosystem, all sorts of things we're trying to highlight. And then we also highlight events. So we'll have different webinar series where we'll bring in folks and talk about our latest research or some of their work. And, again, we try to bring in folks from across the ecosystem. So from employers to researchers to educators and policymakers. So I encourage everyone to stay up to date because we are busy.
It certainly sounds that way based on today's conversation. And we will definitely continue to follow your work and really appreciate you joining us for this conversation today, Kerry.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thanks, Kerry.
That's all we have for you today. Thank you for listening to Workforces. We hope that you take away nuggets that you can use in your own work. Thank you to our sponsor, Lumina Foundation. We are also grateful to our wonderful producer, Dustin Ramsdell. You can listen to future episodes at workforces.info or on Apple, Amazon, and Spotify. Please subscribe, like, and share the podcast with your colleagues and friends.